All right. So, welcome everybody to Los Angeles, which I would say probably the majority of you are already in Los Angeles. So I know we've had people join us from all over the US. Before we get started and hear from our four amazing panelists, I just wanted to touch upon our tours, our 3 tours are coming to an end, and I'm going to take a bit of time before I do something like this again. So I just wanted to take a slight moment to just recall where we've been together on this journey. We started in Jackson, Charleston, Savannah, Macon, Atlanta, Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, New Orleans, Tampa, Santa Fe, Whitefish, Montana, Louisville, which I learned I was saying it wrong the whole time, Louisville, Anchorage, Honolulu, Salt Lake City, Memphis, St. Louis, Trinidad, Colorado, Detroit, Boston, Portland, and here we are now in Los Angeles. We had amazing experiences with connecting with the Hillels at College of Charleston, MIT, Brandeis. We learned how people in Anchorage, Alaska, Jews navigate Shabbat when it doesn't get dark until 1 a.m. in the morning. We learned about Salt Lake City, the collaboration between the Mormon community and the Jewish community. We talked to a foot soldier in Selma, Alabama. We learned about Jews in the bourbon industry in St. Louis. We learned about barbecue contests, kosher barbecue contests in Memphis. We did it all, just to name a few. And I want to mention tomorrow I'm committing my time. I've received several emails from you guys. I'm going to upload them all to YouTube and they'll be accessible from there. So today we have an amazing group of panelists. Dr. Caroline Luce, who is the Associate Director of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies and the Chief Curator of the Levy Center's Mapping Jewish Los Angeles project. We'll hear from Sam Yabri, President and co-founder of 30 Years After. He's an attorney and former LA City Commissioner, amongst many other roles he has had throughout Los Angeles. Shmuel Gonzales, the Barrio Boychik, community organizer and resident historian of Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles, a spiritual leader, dynamic, wonderful person. And then we're going to conclude with Craig Taubman. A lot of you know him as singer-songwriter, founder of the Pico Union Project, and just a wonderful soul. So he'll close us up with some live music. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Luce.
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank y'all so much for being here. This is an incredible turnout, and I'm delighted to be here. As Leah mentioned, yes, and thank you to Leah for the invitation. As Leah mentioned, I am the Associate Director of the Levy Center and the Chief Digital Curator of Mapping Jewish LA, which is the Levy Center's digital public history project. Mapping Jewish LA was launched in 2011 as a collaboration with the UCLA Library, and serves as a bridge between archives and institutions throughout the city, scholars of Jewish history and culture, and students, journalists, and history wonks, and anyone else interested in learning about the many Jewish histories of LA. My own research explores Yiddish-based labor and left-wing organizing in early 20th century LA, but I've been asked today to present more of an overview of LA's 175 years of Jewish history. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now. I'm going to do my best to be as brief as possible to allow time for the other speakers. So I put together a bunch of visuals, and I'm really only going to be able to sort of touch on things. So I'm going to start sharing my screen because it also has the web address for Mapping Jewish LA, should you be interested in learning more. Let me just start the slideshow here. Okay, so it's tricky to sort of summarize all of this history, and so I decided, since you've been touring other cities and regions in the United States, that I'd sort of focus on what makes the West Coast and especially Southern California distinct as a region. And there's kind of two factors here. And the first is is that Southwest is what historians call a borderland, where multiple colonial projects converged. Uh-oh, now I can't change my slides. Hang on one second. There we go. Okay. So, as you probably know, Spanish colonists were the first to come to Southern California in the 16th century. And that's significant because their pattern of colonial settlement differed from that of the British, and it endured well into the 19th century. The Spanish famously established the mission system, including Mission San Gabriel here in the LA Basin. And the missions were sort of agricultural. They were large farms where enslaved indigenous folks worked the fields. They were often supported by presidios or military forts. I grew up in the Presidio, next to the Presidio in San Francisco. And the rest of the land in the area was chopped up into these massive ranchos that were essentially gifted to friends of the Spanish crown and conquistadors. You can see a map here in the bottom corner of the size and scale of those ranchos. Now, the native population, of course, did not like this arrangement, and so there were a series of violent rebellions against the Spanish colonization. So El Pueblo de Reina de Los Angeles in 1781 was established essentially to try to support and bring stability to this colonial settlement. In an effort to sort of stabilize their control. The Spanish crown sent a group of 55 soldiers and 40 settlers to Los Angeles to establish the Pueblo. They divided up the land into tracts, which were given to all the settlers and to indigenous folks as well in an effort to kind of incorporate them into this new settlement. They established a system of waterways and irrigation from the LA River. These are called zanyas to support farming. It was mostly grapes back then, actually. And later oranges. Now, after 1821, as I'm sure you all know, Mexico won its independence from Spain. So Alta California and the Pueblo of Los Angeles was now Mexico. The Mexican government secularized the missions and divided up the mission lands. They abolished slavery. But LA's landscape essentially remained the same. It was ostensibly a very small urban settlement surrounded by these vast acres of ranchos, huge ones. The Sepulveda's rancho was 66,000 acres, or Rancho Santa Monica. These were giant sort of settlements, barely occupied. They were largely sort of absentee landlords, if you will. And in that city center was an incredibly diverse population that included those of mulatto African descent, Californios, which were California-born Spaniards, Mexicans, Indians, and mestizos. This very diverse population, but relatively small. In the 1840s, Anglos and Americans started showing up, essentially squatting on this largely unoccupied rancho land. And thanks to some white landowners in Texas, led by Sam Houston, the U.S. ends up in a war with Mexico in 1846. So American troops invade, overthrew the Cahuenga Pass, and there is the notorious Battle of Los Angeles in 1847. And by 1850, California officially becomes an American state. And at that time of the first census, LA is home to 8 Jewish merchants who ran shops on Bells Row. You can see that in the top picture here. So this brings me to the kind of second regional difference that's significant here, and that is that Jews play an active role in American colonial settlement in the West, and especially in LA. Most of those who came in the early 19th century were from various kingdoms in Central Europe. So Bavaria, Bohemia, Prussia, Posen. Their mobility in those kingdoms was by law restricted. In Bavaria, for example, only the eldest Jewish son could establish a household. There were restrictions on professions and education, and those endured even after these kingdoms started to emancipate their Jewish populations in the course of the mid-19th century. But in the US, by contrast, Jews had what my colleague Sherry Rabin has described as unfettered mobility, right? There are no limits on entry at this point to the country. There are no limits on occupation or commercial activity. Jews had full access to citizenship, which was then limited to all free white persons, and full access to suffrage. So that unfettered mobility was in part owed to their utility in the settlement of the West. Remember the context here. This is the 1850s. America is trying to encourage settlement in its new Western territories. This is the age of the Homestead Act, when vast swaths of land are being given to American colonists. And Jewish peddlers and merchants play crucial roles in the development of market capitalism in these territories. That's especially true as the railroad starts to reach the West after the Civil War. So merchants in the early cities of the West sort of function as hubs of distribution networks, where salespeople, often referred to as peddlers, would take their goods out into farther flung mining communities and railroad towns. By one estimate, in 1850, 90% of the goods coming into the port of San Francisco, for example, were distributed by Jewish merchants. So they play this vital role in kind of expanding the market economy in the West and providing goods. And those 8 Jewish merchants counted in 1850, who were later joined by others, became what historians call urban pioneers, right? They built large wholesale trading enterprises. They made wise investments in real estate, particularly after a drought in the 1860s devastated the Rancho economy. Jews and other settlers purchased huge swaths of land and natural resources. Jews also played crucial roles in civic society as well. There was a Jewish mayor of LA as early as 1878. His name is Bernard Cohen. Herman Silver up here on the left was a water commissioner. He is who Silver Lake Reservoir is named for. Morris Goodman was the first sheriff of Anaheim. So they're serving in all levels of kind of public service. And Jews are also, crucially involved in commerce. And that includes both merchants as well as bankers. One of my favorite examples of these early urban pioneers is a man named Caspar Kohn. Caspar Kohn emigrated from Prussia in 1839. He peddled his way west to join his uncle, Harris Newmark, who was a prominent wholesale merchant in Los Angeles. His uncle sent him up to Fort Tejon, where the Grapevine runs today, to run a sort of outpost of his trading enterprise there. Caspar, you can see him as a young pioneer in the top left. Caspar became the largest purchaser of woolen hides in the state. And through those commercial relationships, particularly with Basque sheep herders, he developed a sort of de facto bank where he was holding their sort of money while they went off and raised their sheep. And then he regularized this into what is today called Union Bank and Trust. Caspar Kohn made wise investments in real estate. As I mentioned before, he purchased a huge rancho that he subdivided into tracts and became the town of Montebello. And a huge Jewish philanthropist. So he's sort of an example of this kind of milieu that I'm describing. In 1854, this group of affluent Jews formed what was called the Hebrew Benevolent Society. It was the city's first charitable organization, and it grew to become the city's first Jewish congregation in 1862 when they recruited Rabbi Edelman here to function. It became Temple B'nai B'rith, now known as the Wilshire Boulevard Temple. It moved there in the 20s. And they had all sorts of sort of charitable functions, including small business loans, lodging for Jewish itinerants, dowries for indigent brides, and particularly cemeteries and funeral rites. The cemetery that they consecrated was originally in Elysian Park. Thanks to a gift from Caspar Kohn, it later moves to East Los Angeles. I'm sure Shmuel can tell us a little bit more on that. So by the 1880s, there are about 300 Jews in LA, affluent, assimilated, and fully integrated into the Anglo elite. And I really want to underscore this here because Jews in LA and in the West, owed to this unfettered mobility, are playing active roles in US colonization. Now, certainly they aren't guilty of genocide of the indigenous population, but they are implicated in the process of displacement and dispossession of Indians, of Mexicans, and of Californios who preceded them. And like their white elite peers, they kind of embraced their status as, quote, pioneers. So this kind of colonial mythology about the West that became a sort of part of the fabric of the city. They fancied themselves as harbingers of modernity and civilization, entitled to the possession of land and natural resources. And that same mythology sort of justifies the continued subordination of the indigenous Mexican and Asian workforce whose labor made colonial settlement possible. And accordingly, Jews participated in the construction of what historians call the Spanish fantasy past, right? This kind of romanticized version of LA's history that foregrounds the Spanish colonial history, captured, for example, in the El Camino Real, and obliterates the Mexican past to sort of position LA as a sort of modern day Pueblo. where the abundance of affordable land, opportunity, and access to sunshine gave everyone access to the easy life. This is kind of a version of the myth of the frontier that is particular to Los Angeles and cultivated as part of the city's civic reputation. So by the turn of the century, amidst the period of mass immigration that brought 20 million people to the US by 1924, this kind of fantasy-laden image of LA starts to attract new groups of Jewish migrants to the city, which grows the LA Jewish population from about 2,500 around 1900 to 40 to 50,000 by 1920. You can see in this chart, it's still comparatively tiny compared to New York, right? It is nowhere near the size, but the rate of growth, the pace of growth of Los Angeles' Jewish population is actually much faster than New York's, if you can believe that. So I'm going to talk about two groups of these new arrivals, the first of which is my area of specialty, which is Jews from Eastern Europe, which is to say this area here, comprising modern-day Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, and Moldova, then known as the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was a special zone established by the Russian Empire after the annexation of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the late 18th century, and it was a special zone where Jews were required to live. Jewish mobility in the Russian Empire was very constrained in other ways as well, particularly after the assassination of the Tsar in 1881. Jews were denied access to education. Their traditional autonomous community structure was completely dismantled. They were denied rights to own land and work in certain occupations. And as the Russian Empire attempted to industrialize this borderland zone of the Pale, Jews were increasingly marginalized in the economy. And of course, as you all probably know, Jewish communities were subject to mob attacks known as pogroms, anti-Semitic mob attacks. So there were an abundance of reasons why during this period, about a third of the Jewish population of the Pale leaves. 2.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe come to the United States by 1924. In terms of their arrival in Los Angeles, most had already spent at least 5 or 10 years in the cities of the East, right? They don't come directly to LA, they come through the port cities of the East, which means most came with some English language fluency and often some savings to afford their trip. But they differ from their predecessors in really important ways. For one, there were significant religious differences. Oh, I'm going to go back, actually. There were significant religious differences. Jews from Eastern Europe tended to be more religiously observant. They were sometimes raised in the Hasidic tradition rather than the Reformed traditions of Central Europe and Germany, which meant they had a different minhag, different seder, a different style of worship. There, of course, were linguistic and cultural differences. These were Yiddish-speaking Jews who preferred stroniki and shkav into haute cuisine. And many were more politically radical, which is to say they had been involved in the revolutionary movements that emerged in this area in opposition to the Tsar. Many had been part of socialist or Zionist parties and brought those ideologies and those networks of organizing to Los Angeles. And they came to LA and sort of immediately got involved in labor unions and socialist organizations that were fomenting opposition to the civic and business elite that their fellow Jews had become a part of, right? I'll happily talk about this more later. This, of course, is my area of expertise. Now, in the 1910s, this Eastern European population started shifting into Boyle Heights. Boyle Heights had, to that point, been a relatively affluent suburb. It was known as the Nob Hill of the City of Angels. But after a series of bridges and streetcar lines were constructed over the LA River, and the city moved to rezone the area south of downtown along the railroad lines as an industrial district, the landowners in the neighborhood, and I don't know if you can see it on this multicolored map here on the right, but landowners in the neighborhood rapidly subdivide and sell off their holdings in the neighborhood. You could buy a lot for as cheap as $600 in Boyle Heights. And there were no restrictive racial covenants prohibiting the sale of this property to what is often described as non-Caucasian. Covenants were these little clauses in mortgages and real estate contracts that prohibited folks from selling to anyone who wasn't Caucasian. As we'll talk about, whether Jews are Caucasian or not is up to the discretion of the seller. But in this case, the lack of covenants in Boyle Heights was part of the attraction. And so Boyle Heights rapidly filled up. By 1930, it was home to about 25,000 Jewish families. And for that reason is often remembered as kind of a Jewish neighborhood. Now, that Jewish atmosphere was in part owed to the businesses along Brooklyn Avenue, most famously Cantor's, but there were dozens of sort of Jewish-owned businesses along that major thoroughfare. It was in part owed to the presence of religiously observant Jews, right? They gave sort of a Jewish visibility to the neighborhood and a particular kind of rhythm of Jewish observant life. But in my argument, of course, this was primarily due to the presence of Yiddish culture. The radicals that I write about created Yiddish schools, radical political parties, Yiddish-based fraternal organizations, including the Arbiter Ring, pictured here in the center. They founded a Yiddish press. They did protests and street speaking, the entire Yiddish world that, again, I would be happy to discuss more, but I'm going to sort of breeze along here. And for that reason, Boyle Heights is often referred to as, quote, the Lower East Side of Los Angeles. But I really find that characterization problematic. And that's in part because it doesn't quite capture the unique diversity of Boyle Heights. So this is a map I created for an exhibit that I did a couple years ago. The dots here indicate the head of households and their country of origin. The blue dots are generally countries in Eastern Europe. The greens are kind of Central Europe, yellows being Western Europe. Reds are Central and South America. The purples are Asia and the Middle East. And the orange is the United States and Canada. Through this research, I identified 43 different countries of origin just in this small swath of the neighborhood. So it's not to say that the Lower East Side wasn't diverse, but this is a unique type of diversity, a convergence of diasporas that you don't see elsewhere. There were just as many Mexican and Mexican-American families in Boyle Heights as there were Jewish families, and also large numbers of Japanese, Russian, and Armenian Americans, as well as African Americans, particularly in the area down here around Evergreen Cemetery. Shmuel is, I'm sure, going to talk about this more, so I'll leave it there. Now, the second wave of arrivals in the early 20th century that I need to note here were Sephardic Jews from Ottoman lands, particularly Istanbul, Rhodes, Salonika, and Izmir. Now, their immigration was due less to explicit kind of Jewish marginalization and more to the kind of dissolution of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. That was owed in part to the fact that other colonial powers started taking over Ottoman territories, particularly the French in North Africa. There were also internal rebellions, including the Young Turks Rebellion in 1907, 1908. And so while Jewish mobility was constrained under Ottoman rule through the so-called millet system that I can answer questions about later, this was more about the general sort of instability and what you might call decay of the Ottoman Empire was kind of collapsing around them, which was limiting Jewish participation in the economy and sort of marginalizing them economically. So these Jews also differed from their predecessors. They brought with them specific religious traditions, those descended from medieval Spain. That's where the word Sephardic comes from. Particular linguistic traditions. So these were often Ladino-speaking Jews, which is a form of Judeo-Spanish, which actually helped them in LA because they could converse with the Mexican population. And they tended to come as family groups. So this was a much smaller, much more tightly knit community. I was doing some research for a recent project we did on celebrating 100 years of Sephardic life in LA. And in one residential hotel called the Bixby Hotel, I found 5 different groups of brothers. So Sam, Mike, and Bahor Israel, Morris, Lewis, and Abraham Kahan, Israel and Abraham Al-Hadef, Robert Morris, Lewis, and something else, Menashe, right? So out of 100 residents, 14 Jews from Ottoman lands, 13 of whom worked as bootblacks. And so in this community, you have ties of kinship, language, religion, and often sort of commerce, commercial relationships. The Sephardic population tended to work as kind of street vendors, selling particularly flowers and fruit, and so they lived near the wholesale markets where those goods were distributed, including the LA Flower Mart and the LA Produce Mart, and work as shoe shiners, as I mentioned. The residence was concentrated sort of south of Alameda in an area around Wall Street, which is depicted here. And they formed their own kind of fraternal religious organizations analogous to the Hebrew Benevolent Society, including the Pazzi Progressive Society, which was made up of Rhodesley Jews, and La Comunidad, which was made up of Turquinos, if you will. Over time, as fruit stands grew into produce markets and flower stands into florist shops, this community shifted south and west of downtown, rather than east into Boyle Heights, into an area that was once known as Exhibition Park. You can see it down here, sort of straddling West Adams. So here's a map created by one of my colleagues. You can see here the fraternal organizations grew into synagogues, including Temple Tifereth Israel and what was known as the Sephardic Hebrew Center. But this neighborhood, unlike Boyle Heights, was actually mostly white. It was 80% American-born, cops, lawyers, salesmen, real estate agents. So it was a little bit more affluent, definitely more white. And the Sephardic community sort of formed a community within a community. As you can see, the residence patterns are incredibly tight-knit and sort of centralized around the synagogues, often families living next door to each other, or down the street from each other. Okay, now you'll notice one group I haven't mentioned is the Jews of Hollywood, right? And I can, of course, answer more or speak more to that later. But what I will say now is that the Jews of Hollywood really helped to promote the city's growth. By 1915, 90% of films in the United States are made here in LA in the studios of Hollywood. And so that dream, that kind of fantasy-laden image of LA really proliferates through Hollywood's representation of LA on the silver screen. So in the 1920s, in combination with the discovery of oil in Long Beach and the growth of the garment and rubber industries in LA, LA became the Akron of the West, if you can believe that. LA booms. Both the population of the city and the county doubled between 1920 and 1925. The Jewish population reached over 90,000 by the end of the decade. And as compared to previous waves, the US had passed restrictive immigration law in 1924 that effectively cut off Jewish immigration from Europe. So these new arrivals tended to be American-born Jews, or at least naturalized citizens who came with their American-born children. And the pace of arrivals really continued through the so-called Great Depression unabated. It neither expanded nor decreased during the Depression. Hollywood, of course, was a draw for some who came in the 1930s, particularly writers and actors who had previously kind of written off Hollywood and film as serious art, who came to LA seeking work. And also they were joined by the leading lights of Weimar Germany, who came to LA seeking refuge from the Nazis. So there's a big change in Hollywood in the 1930s that, again, I'm happy to speak about more maybe afterwards, but they really helped to usher in a golden age of Hollywood, these new arrivals in Hollywood. But I'm really trying to keep our focus today here on the sort of regular folks, if you will, of the Jewish community. And so that is in part because the new arrivals of the 1930s usher in a sort of subtle demographic shift that really accelerates in the post-war era. The growth of LA's industrial economy and, crucially, its public education system, including UCLA, which opened its campus in Westwood in 1929, providing affordable access to college education. This gives rise to a new managerial class among the local Jewish population. The labor protections of the New Deal resulting in wave of unionization that brings 100,000 new trade unionists to Los Angeles by 1937 with good wages and job security. And the New Deal's economic and infrastructure development programs also create thousands of new white-collar jobs open to young American, often college-educated Jews. So you start to see this shift that the statistics here kind of capture. A rising number of Jews working as professionals and small business owners rather than as laborers and artisans. And after the 1940 Defense Production Act, which pumped $11 billion of federal funds into the local economy, Los Angeles' economy boomed again. So by the eve of World War II, even before the US has entered World War II, LA's got a much more affluent Jewish population who are much more likely to buy homes and to work in either professions or in a small business. That sort of rising affluent coincided with a period of urban renewal and suburbanization in LA. So one of the New Deal's lesser known programs is called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. It was designed to stabilize the mortgage market that had completely collapsed and gone upside down in the 1930s. And the way that they did that stabilization was they sent inspectors out to evaluate the, quote, riskiness of loans in certain neighborhoods so that banks would know where to give mortgages and where not to. They had a scale, blue being the best and red being the worst. And I will say that these assessments were explicitly racial. So keep a sense of this map. I'll try to come back to it. And my slide changing is not working very well. But so this is pulled from the HOLC form describing Boyle Heights as, quote, literally honeycombed with diverse and subversive racial elements. You can notice, actually, if we go back just for 1 second, the area in South LA where the Sephardic population had settled, you'll notice is also sort of redlined here. So what does this redlining mean? Well, it means it becomes nearly impossible to get home loans in those areas. It was almost impossible to get a bank to give you a mortgage in a redline district. It also meant that state and federal authorities were more likely to pick those areas that had been deemed blighted by this redlining to build their freeways, right? To build freeways that would then service these new suburban communities. So in the case of Boyle Heights, I mean, look at the map, right? If anyone's familiar with where the freeways go, you can see they're right in those red areas. What this means for Boyle Heights in particular is that 5 major freeways are built in and around the neighborhood between 1943 and 1960, some of them cutting right through the heart of the neighborhood. And as I mentioned, since their early settlement in the 19th century, Jews had access to whiteness and were always able to more easily transgress the racial borders built in and around Boyle Heights. That is not to say there was no anti-Semitism or no discrimination. It's just to say that in combination with this rising economic mobility engendered by the New Deal and later the GI Act, that by the 1940s, Jews participate in a phenomenon that historians call white flight, which is essentially to say more affluent white residents transgressing the color lines built around the freeways built around the neighborhood in the form of the freeways and purchasing homes in other areas. I mean, it sort of makes rational sense. If you're a young college graduate who was raised in Boyle Heights and you're ready to purchase a small house with your wife, you can't get a loan in the neighborhood, you're gonna settle somewhere else. So this white flight happens both in South LA in the Sephardic community that gradually shifts west into Ladera Heights and La Cienega Heights, and it happens in Boyle Heights as well. So by 1955, the Jewish population in Boyle Heights has declined 72%. I think Shmuel is going to talk about this a little bit more, so I'll leave that there. But this white flight is accompanied by the arrival of thousands of new arrivals from similarly diverse working class neighborhoods in New York, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit. Maybe some of your families arrived in LA in this period. In the post-war era, Jewish westward migration and suburbanization explodes, and the Jewish population reaches over 400,000 by 1960. This creates an entirely new Jewish geography of the city and the region. And as you can see, it really shifts from a population born in LA to a population of new arrivals. By 1958, half of Jews had arrived after 1948. So this new Jewish geography includes the Beverly Fairfax neighborhood, right? Which is to say westward migration in the city, sort of around Beverly Fairfax, where I live, which becomes home to 15,000 Jewish households by 1950, roughly 75 to 90,000 Jews. It also, of course, includes the Valley, particularly the San Fernando Valley, Reseda, Sherman Oaks, and Van Nuys in particular. And this kind of suburban period gives rise to what some historians describe as a new suburban Jewish lifestyle. So some of the hallmarks of that lifestyle include synagogues that were more like campuses. Think particularly of Leo Beck Temple or Stephen S. Wise Temple, right? These sprawling campuses with, hundreds of member families, sometimes thousands of member families, full recreational facilities and schools. They often had gyms on site, schools on site, pools on site. This also gives rise to a new effort to engage women as the center of religious life in the household. Remember, traditionally men are the center of religious life of a Jewish household. In this period, we see a shift, an attentiveness to women and women playing roles in synagogues in ways they had never before. And that includes things like sisterhood gift shops, right? Where you could buy Judaica and adorn your Jewish home, cooking classes, all sorts of stuff like that. And of course, classically, it includes summer camps and Jewish education. So I have some stats here on enrollment in Jewish schools, skyrockets in the post-war era. The post-war era, we also see the rise of Camp Ramah, Camp Wise, Camp Alonim, and this sort of summer camp system as we think of it today. Not exclusive to the post-war era, I will say, but certainly grows in this kind of moment of suburbanization. So historian Deborah Dash Moore has described this period as a sort of realizing of a new American Jewish dream that really was realized in golden cities, including Los Angeles and Miami, this kind of new style of American Jewish life. Now, that's not to say that Jewish immigration ends. And in fact, Jewish immigration, particularly in the post-war era, expands and continues to diversify and grow the LA Jewish community. So, in fact, bringing Jewish immigrants and particularly refugees becomes a major part of Jewish community life as well, a major sort of source of community organization and mobilization. That really starts with efforts to bring displaced people and Holocaust refugees to LA in the immediate post-war years. I noted this on a previous slide, but by 1953, at least 10, if not 15,000 displaced people and their family are settled in Los Angeles, particularly in the area around Pan Pacific Park and Beverly Fairfax. And they create new institutions there, including the LA Museum of the Holocaust. In the late 60s and 70s, of course, famously, LAJ becomes a major outpost of the Save Sylvia Jewelry campaign. There were massive marches, telethons, billboards, charity runs, and by 1995, some 25,000 Sylvia Jews were settled in Los Angeles, particularly in West Hollywood, where there's a vibrant sort of Sylvia Jewish community. And Jewish immigration accelerates even further after 1965, when the United States finally removes its prohibitions on immigration from Asia and the Middle East, which had been in place since 1924, and specifically for China since 1882. Sam, I'm sure, will discuss the Persian Jewish community, which of course comes to LA in the late 70s and 80s. There is a Moroccan Jewish diaspora here in LA that really picks up in the 70s and 80s, centered around the congregation Habanim, which is now in the Valley. There's a Baghdadi and Iraqi Jewish diaspora in LA, centered around Kahal Joseph. And the newest wave has really been of Israelis. So there are something like 100,000 Israelis who settled in LA. So today, LA is home to one of the most diverse Jewish populations in the world. I would argue the most diverse, but that's an uninformed opinion. I just sort of say that. It's about 650,000 Jews. And it's this convergence of diasporas, each with their own distinct cultural and religious traditions and their own distinct institutions, all of whom have been woven into the urban fabric of the city. So to me, LA is sort of a magical example. What really makes it distinct is that it's a place where multiple Jewish diasporas met, collided, merged, and built communities, offering a rich tapestry of many Jewish histories that are at once global, regional, local, and uniquely golden. So I'm going to leave it there and stop my share now. I did notice some questions popping up in the chat. I think I'll hold those maybe and address them after the other speakers get a chance to talk, if that's all right with you, Leah? Yeah?
Sounds great.
Okay. I'm sorry if I went on for.
Oh, all good. This was so incredibly in-depth and informative, and I bet many people here have learned things they had never heard before. Thank you. That mapping project's incredible. So now, as Dr. Luce had mentioned a couple times, Shmuel, he is one of my favorite people, wonderful, also known as the Barrio Boychik. You should check out his blog. He's a spiritual leader, one of the most brilliant historians, and he's going to talk about the Latino-Jewish community, the various programs open to Jews of color here in Moish House. He's going to touch upon a range of different things. And another thing I want to mention, he's a mediator. He is always building bridges between communities, which is so important. So thank you. With that said, Shmuel.
Hey, thank you. Can everyone hear me well? Okay, so our sound's coming out through. Okay, excellent. So thank you for having me, Leah. I'm really glad to be able to share. And I'm actually coming to you today from Boyle Heights, from the Boyle Heights History Studios Museum and Cultural Center. And we actually have our own cultural center here that's dedicated to sharing about you know, these multicultural histories that are shared between, you know, not just Jewish people, Latino people, Japanese people, African-American people within this neighborhood. As, you know, this community really was a destination community for working class immigrant people in the first half of the 20th century. My community, it just really has one of these dynamic histories. Let me start my screen share real quick. Wanted to bring up some images so that you can kind of appreciate what I'm talking about. Let me bring up my screen.
I just made you a co-host.
Okay, excellent. So let me go ahead and I think I got my screen share here. So yeah, just 1 second. Okay, let me see. Let me see if I can get this here. Just 1 second. Okay, hopefully, Leah, you see the Breed Street Shul on your screen right now, correct?
Right
Okay,
now we see, we are not on the first slide. We're not looking at the Breed Street Shul. It's the title, Boyle Heights History Studios and Tours.
Okay, so let me go ahead. Okay, so let me go ahead and I'm sorry about that. Again, I'm still learning how to utilize all these Zoom features. So 1 second.
We're on the Synagogue now. That's what we're looking at.
Okay, so so on the Synagogue right now. Okay, and okay, so you're able to see it. Okay, and then do you see a juxtaposition of Jewish themes right now? Let me try ending my share. Let me try doing this again. 1 second. I apologize for this. We have just a little bit of difficulty with my computer here. Okay, hey, do you see a juxtaposition of some culture on screen right there?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. And so what happens is that when people think of Boyle Heights, what they often think about, you know, Boyle Heights was you know, the largest Jewish community west of Chicago in the first half of the 20th century. And that's what this building, the Breed Street Shul, represents. It was the largest synagogue west of the Mississippi, and the largest community, Jewish community west of the Mississippi. And then to make a connection back to Beth Am, the rabbi here, who was the chief rabbi of Los Angeles, Rabbi Osher Zilberstein, was the father of Rabbi Harry Silverstein, who was the rabbi of Beth Am, Rabbi Emeritus. Whoever was the rabbi of the shul was de facto the chief rabbi of Los Angeles. And you know, we had over 75,000 Jewish people who came through this neighborhood during the first half of the 20th century. And, you know, it's really left the marks, you know, within, you know, our neighborhood of these, you know, real juxtaposition of culture, you know, within our neighborhood. And it's still, you know, really vibrant. You still see it very much celebrated to this day. So that's what I actually do within the neighborhood. I actually go out regularly and, you know, show all those signs of how it's kind of celebrated, and take people out, you know, on tours, you know, really exploring a lot of people's family history. That's what's kind of unique about what my cultural center does, is that we don't take any grant or philanthropy money. We're entirely operated by, you know, just some donations we get through tours, usually going to the neighborhood in order to explore the multicultural history of their families, people who grew up, their families had grown up in Boyle Heights, and they're wanting to explore their families' working class immigrant history. And so we have a museum that's dedicated to that, the Boyle Heights History Studios, Museum and Cultural Center. And we actually have a really, really wonderful installation that was put together by the Alan D. Levy Center, and the chief curator on it was Professor Luce, my great friend here. She actually put this wonderful, wonderful exhibit together for the Alan D. Levy Center, called From Brooklyn Avenue to Cesar Chavez, Jewish Histories in Multi-Ethnic Boyle Heights. And so it is on display at our cultural center. You can come any day of the week from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. in order to really be able to learn about the overlap of the multiculturalism and what you know, Jewish people growing up within this neighborhood with peoples of other ethnicities during a time of discrimination, you know, during a time of Jim Crow segregation, really how it animated people to have to build a civil rights movement. You know, first starting labor rights, later moving on to civil rights So, you know, there's really a whole lot to share. And on top of that, we also have the great honor, I have the great honor of being able to, you know, host the Boyle Heights Historical, the Grassroots Jewish Fellowship of East Los Angeles. You know, I'm very fortunate that, you know, we have a location in which we're able to welcome people to have Shabbat and to have holidays. And, you know, it's really caught the attention of people, you know, in the neighborhood, you know, that we are not just talking about Jewish history, but there are some of us that are still alive, keeping that multiculturalism alive. That's how we became friends, Leah. You know, you had asked people, there's this whole history of the Jewish community in Boyle Heights. 75,000 Jewish people went through there. Well, you know, where's the Jewish people now? And they're like, no, there's none there. You know, people just kind of assume, but yeah, that can't be. So she Googled and she found these videos of us doing Havdalah and lighting menorahs and weird stuff. And she came out, you know, to the neighborhood, and it's been catching attention ever since. This is from our sukkah, you know, this past year. We put up a sukkah this year, and it was great. You know, we finally have, you know, a lot of the, you know, people in my community. People used to ask, how do we get more active people in Boyle Heights, being that we're a dwindling community of pretty much only, you know, grandparents and, you know, the very young, you know what I mean? One of those type of, you know, dwindling communities. So like, well, we have to make them. Well, you know, in these final years, a lot of my friends are finally having children. And so I was like, no, our kids are going to grow up with the experience of having all the Judaism, you know, right here in the backdrop of our community, which is really impressive because today the community is 98.5% Mexican American. And so what you're looking at is a community that is you know, we are the grandchildren, the great grandchildren of mostly Eastern European Jews, Central and Eastern European Jews, some Sephardic Jews in the neighborhood. You know, we're still, you know, here within the neighborhood, you know, really, you know, keeping our culture alive. But you know what I didn't appreciate when I was a young person, that I was so lucky, you know, to grow up in a city of Los Angeles that was a world-class Jewish community that had diversity just kind of ingrained into it. And that's because it was so obvious to people, I guess, that they didn't really show it. For example, you know, if we're talking about North America, it should, you know, I shouldn't feel weird as a Sephardic Jew, as a Spanish Portuguese Jew, because, you know, that is the foundation of American Judaism, with Spanish Portuguese Jews coming, you know, on the heels of the Inquisition through the Americas, you know, fleeing persecution, coming up to be the first Jewish people in Americas in the 1600s. Naturally, there would be Sephardic, Spanish, Portuguese Jews that would leave their mark on the foundation of early Los Angeles. And it's true, early Los Angeles, even though it's not really taught by people, it should be. You know, the first institution that we have founded in Los Angeles in the early years of the American statehood here, in 1854, that first Jewish institution that was established, the Hebrew Benevolent Society, it was created in 1854, created at the behest of Salome Núñez Galvallo, the American artist and you know, pioneering, you know, explorer who came to document the West for the American government, wanted to find out what the West was like. And you know, him and some of our local merchants, such as the Labatts, Samuel K. Labatt, who founded the Hebrew Benevolent Society, they looked to what Jewish life was like in the North American Jewish Mecca of the time, which was Charleston, South Carolina. Yeah, and so they decided to bring their institutions here, and they did. And so consequently, they built the Hebrew Benevolent Society. And you know, the institution still exists to this day. We just know it as Jewish Family Services, mostly serving non-Jewish people, but still doing, still helping, it's still the largest charity within Los Angeles County. And is the oldest charity within Los Angeles County. But it's important to note that we do have this history of these people being this diversity that goes back to the beginning, that there were Sephardic Jews, not just you know, German Jews, you know, from Prussia, and then later on from Poland, you know, Russia, and places like this. We did have Sephardic Jews that came up from you know, communities like where my family came up from, Brazil. On picture on screen right now is Mikva Yisrael Emmanuel Synagogue in Curaçao, Brazil, where my family had come from. And what you'll notice about this oldest synagogue in the Americas is that it has sand on the floor. They put sand on the floor so that in the ages of discrimination, of fearing the Inquisition was going to come, the sand would absorb the prayers so it didn't echo off the walls. And consequently, that really didn't save us. So we did have to come to the Americas in order to find our salvation. And so that, yeah, the sand on our Brazilian floors was to buffer the noise of our prayers. We're having to do it incognito, you know what I mean, to not be burned at the stake. And so consequently, you know, our families come up to the Americas to be the first, you know, the first families that you know, build a Judaism in the United States. And so it's very, I wish people had taught that, you know, when I was young. But, you know, these people were very transient, so they left their marks. These people I'm talking about later on went to found the Jewish communities of Waco and Galveston and places like this. So very influential, you know, Sephardic families that helped build up the West. And so it's, you know, it's great to be able to teach that history along the way.
I just want to mention we're kind of running behind on time. So if you could just briefly share about the Moishe House here.
Oh, yeah. You know, what's really cool is that our Moshe houses are really, you know, we have two really great Moshe houses. It's not just us that have our community within the area that are doing things ad hoc now. We actually do have some real establishment groups that are coming in. Do you know that recently we built a Moshe house, a Jews of Color Moshe house on downtown Los Angeles near 8th and Hope, where, you know, right in the core, as the move has been coming to downtown Los Angeles, you know, it's really been Persian Jews and Jews from South America that have really been part of the influx of new residents that are moving to be part of these new, you know, the new dynamic life, Jewish life that's going on in downtown Los Angeles. So naturally, they built a Moishe house there. So we have a Jews of Color Moishe house. What's great about that is that, you know, Bryce and them, you know, we really have a lot of events where we really show the diversity of our cultures through food, because most people think that we're all a bunch of Mexicans. You know, if you have a Latino Jews of Color Moshe house, no, we actually have a lot of people that come from Argentina, that come from Brazil, that come from Venezuela, come from Colombia, and, you know, also from the Caribbean. We have our Dominican Jews. So we have you know, we have, you know, African Latino Jews who are really parts of helping make this possible. We also recently, in the last year, we got a Moishe house in Pico Robertson, which is a Latina Jews of Color Moishe house.
Can you just mention real quick what the Moishe house is? Yeah,
Moishe houses are really, you know, really what they are is they are set up as, you know, makeshift community centers for young Jewish people in order for, you know, people to have an autonomous space in order to have programming. So it's pretty much like, you know, if you had a Hillel house but for the community. You see what I mean? That's not just tied to a school institution. It's really you know, more of the Jewish clubhouse for, you know, a certain neighborhood. And so that's great that we not only have one in downtown, but we actually have one that's specifically geared for Latinos, put together by two Jewish Latinas from Peru in Pico Robertson, right in the heart of the Jewish community. And so that's really, really great that, you know, it is really just kind of a no-brainer. And I say that is because, you know, really the diversity of the Jewish community, what really makes it great is that along the way, really what makes it great within the Los Angeles Jewish communities, on top of it all, having that presence is not just good in helping making a place for those of us who have, you know, our Jewish roots, but also for people who are trying to connect to their Jewish roots, people who are unaffiliated. That's really becoming more of the story. And if you come out to Boyle Heights, you get to, you know, learn more about that, about how a lot of our communities are becoming, are really becoming a place in which we're teaching Latino people. 25% of Latino people are descendants of Jewish people. They are doing their ancestry.com and they're learning about their Jewish roots, and now they are wanting to learn about Judaism. And so now we're able to actually do cross-cultural events with a lot of Latino groups in Los Angeles in order to show what the contributions of Judaism to Latino culture as well. So we're very, very, in Los Angeles, you know, Jewish Latinos are celebrated in so many ways for so many different contributions. And I think that's beautiful.
So we're gonna, I'm sure many of you have questions for Shmuel. We're gonna save all the questions for the end at this point. But thank you so much, Shmuel, to hear from you. It's always lovely to hear from you, and your knowledge is just incredible. So I also am thinking about Los Angeles, a population that is such a large percentage of the community are Iranian Jews. And from what I understand, Los Angeles has the largest Iranian population in the United States. So because it is such a significant part of our community, I wanted to make sure that we talk to Sam Yabri, who can tell you more about the work that he's done.
Well, thank you, Leah. You're right. Los Angeles is home to the largest community of Iranian Americans, and specifically Iranian American Jews in the world, outside of Iran in terms of Iranian Americans, and for Jews outside of Israel, where there is a large Iranian Jewish population. I'm very grateful to be able to present the Persian Jewish story, and that we're being represented today. It's an important development, and I want to thank you and Temple Beth Am for that. I want to also thank Caroline and Shmuel for that beautiful background, specifically on the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community dating back to the Hebrew Benevolent Society in 1854, and then Sephardic Temple in 1920, which is celebrating its 100th anniversary. Those are the forebears of the Mizrahi Jewish community and Persian Jewish community specifically. So our story begins in 1979. The relatively safe experience of Iran's approximately 100,000 Jews was shattered. The Islamic Revolution ushered in severe persecution of Jews, including the execution of several Jewish leaders in Iran. And what followed was a bloody 8-year war between Iran and Iraq. For my family, what we call our exodus moment was when my grandfather was imprisoned for simply being a Zionist, for having sent money to Israel and corresponded with our family there. When I was a year old in 1982, my parents left everything and were smuggled across the border to Pakistan on the backs of camels and on jeeps. And with the help of HIAS, we made it to Europe, and eventually we were granted asylum in the United States. And as Carolyn mentioned, the laws began to change in the late 70s and early 80s. My story may sound dramatic, but it's quite common among Iranian Jews. We all have some variation of that story in the late 70s, 80s, and some more recently. What followed was resettlement in Los Angeles. The question often arises, why Los Angeles? And it's not just the weather, but that certainly played a role. UCLA, in its wisdom, had granted access to students from around the world in the 60s and 70s, and for many Jews from Iran, their children were sent to UCLA, and it became a natural pipeline. And also, large Jewish population in Los Angeles, to its credit, was incredibly welcoming. So as a result, Los Angeles became the ideal destination for Jews fleeing persecution from Iran. The first step was survival. With the help of some of the organizations like HIAS and ORT and the Jewish Federation and JFS, Iranian Jews found places to live, schools to attend, places to worship. In fact, the Orthodox Beth Jacob Synagogue in Beverly Hills opened its basement for the first Iranian minyan in the late 70s, which ultimately became the Nesaf Synagogue in Beverly Hills. Our community is now 50,000 members strong, at least in Los Angeles. And what followed was in the 80s was rebuilding our communal institutions from Iran in the prior image, insular, inward-looking, traditional, in the hopes of staying safe and staying Jewish, which were the ingredients for survival in Iran. And as a result, some of the social service organizations, synagogues, and schools had a very inward-looking perspective, and those popped up largely on the west side in the San Fernando Valley. But over the last 4 decades, our community has opened up, as has been the pattern of waves of prior Jewish refugees. And in this process, we've played a role in strengthening the broader Jewish community in terms of membership in synagogues of all denominations, schools, philanthropy, advocacy. Of course, there have been some growing pains along the way between the Ashkenazi and the Persian communities, But on the whole, I think we've grown and past some of those friction, some of that natural friction. In 2007, to that end, I and a group of young professionals from the Iranian Jewish community co-founded an organization called 30 Years After, whose mission is to promote the participation and leadership of Iranian American Jews in Jewish civic and political life in the United States. We felt that it was time for our community of young Jews and the broader Iranian Jewish community to fully embrace our responsibilities as Americans and as Jews. Over the last 13 years, we've held hundreds of events, conferences, leadership training programs, reached more than 10,000 members of the Iranian Jewish community, helped spawn new initiatives, some of them being in the advocacy realm, some of them is focusing on things like LGBTQ issues, Israel advocacy, and the like. Some of our graduates and some of our members have become board members and staff members of different Jewish organizations around the town, including the director of finance at Temple Beth Am is one of our proud former board members of 30 Years After. In recent years, we've also seen Iranian American Jews become leaders in philanthropy. The Nazarian family, for example, have endowed the Israel Study Center at UCLA and the Soraya Cultural Center and the business school at CSUN. Iranian Jews have become leaders in medicine, law, business, real estate, and now more also in the arts and in other areas as well. And now you see also in the generation of Iranian Jews born here, right after a few years younger than myself, there's more civic activism. Our community has historically been politically conservative or traditional, and we see a generational shift in greater activism in the greater community. And I'm optimistic that our wave of Jewish refugees from Iran, especially the young generation, those of us who stand on the shoulders of prior generations, are ready to help strengthen the greater Jewish community and help shape a better Los Angeles. And to end this full circle, this is really happening because of the work of Jewish organizations from around this city that over the last 4 decades have welcomed the Iranian Jewish community. And as a result, we realized that our fates as Jews in America are linked with the fates of our fellow Jewish Americans and as well as our fellow Angelinos. So I'll end it there. There may be some questions. I know I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Sam. I just thought it was so important to share all this because it's what makes LA distinct, our diversity. It's one of our greatest strengths as a Jewish peoplehood. I think, so that's why I wanted to focus on this. So thank you, all the panelists. We're about to turn it over to Craig. Craig, I wanted to, I'm wondering if before we play some music, maybe ask like 2 to 3 questions. Are you okay with that, Craig? How's your time?
Absolutely.
You have the time? Okay. All right. So let's just
I said absolutely, of course.
Okay.
You gave me 25 minutes, right? You give me 25 minutes?
Questions will be like 5 minutes. We'll allocate that. And then we'll turn it over to you. So, all right. So any questions? Feel free to raise your hand. Paul.
This is for Sam. Could you talk a little bit about the status, if any, of Iranian Jews still trying to flee Iran and the difficulties, challenges with that, if it's
Yes,
in large numbers?
Great question. So there's about 8,000 to 10,000 Jews left in Iran. Most of those who wanted to leave have left, to be frank. Those who still remain fall in a few categories. They're either very old, who want to kind of spend their last days in the land of their birth, maybe very religious, feel a kinship that they have to protect the synagogues, the cemeteries, these Jewish institutions that have been there for 3,000 years, Esther's tomb. Or there's some who actually do business and go back and forth and are doing fine. But those who wanted to leave have left. That doesn't mean there isn't anti-Semitism. There's definitely the Jews of Iran are monitored. Their phones are tapped. They cannot travel freely. They cannot go to Israel. There is a non-voting member of the parliament in Iran, the Majlis, who is forced to attack Israel and America. That's his role. So it's that's really the conditions, and they're there as in some ways as a hostage given U.S.-Iran or Israel-Iran relations. And they're kept in that condition also as sort of a prop for the world to show, look, there are these minorities that still are alive and surviving, and we haven't done anything violent to them. But Israel has tried to help those who wanted to leave, and still there's been a trickle. It's worth mentioning the Trump administration has stopped the asylum process for anyone from the Middle East as part of the travel ban or Muslim ban. Those think of it as just Muslims. It's not. It's Jews, Christians, Baha'is from Iran who can't flee. Of note, Baha'is and Christians are especially persecuted. Of course, there's other two, gays and journalists and dissidents who are being persecuted in Iran who can't leave because of asylum anymore. So it's a longer answer to your question, but that's sort of the condition.
So we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Barbara. We cannot hear.
Building. You can't hear?
Yeah, we
Okay,
can hear
go
you.
ahead.
Okay. There's a building where you go up Hoover and it separates to Alvarado and Hoover that I was told was always a church. I find it hard to believe that it wasn't a synagogue, and I guess maybe from what you said about locations of populations, the Sephardic temple, because it has several Magen Davids in windows on that building. Do you know anything about that? Oh, Shmuel seems to
Yeah, I actually know about that. And, really one of the things that's important to recognize is that, whenever people build buildings, whatever you do with glass and bricks, you do what people call sacred, sacred geometry. And believe it or not, no, it's always been a church. It was never a synagogue. Actually, that building was the People's Temple of Jim Jones. Here in Los Angeles. And so it was never a Jewish building. And matter of fact, never connected to the Sephardic communities in the area. Believe it or not, it's a lot of churches, and places use, just whatever general type of, sacred geometry that you could do. Believe it or not, our first synagogue in Los Angeles had had several stars all over it. But they were not six-pointed stars. They were upside down, five-pointed stars, which if you're into death metal, people are cool, no. They were just using generic symbols, which is called the Eastern Star. And so some of the older buildings, they have these kind of things that throw us off. But that's a good guess, because it is kind of surrounded around the area where the Sephardic Brotherhood and, all those in on Hoover, we had Sephardic. But yeah, it actually has a little bit darker story of actually being the People's Temple of Jim Jones in the 1970s. And so yeah.
So he built it? Jim Jones built it?
And no, it was built by a Congregational church, and now it's an Adventist church. Yeah. And of course, it's changed with the immigration. Now it's mostly Central American.
With that said, why don't we go ahead and turn this over to Craigula? I had the pleasure to work with Craig over the years, and we graduated to the name Craigula. You there?
I think so. Am I here?
All right. I'm going to make you the speaker view since you're playing some music so we can see you.
How much time do I have? Like 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 to 10 minutes. If you could first share a little bit about the Pico Union Project, and then I don't know if you have time. I was thinking Hashki Venu could be a really great song, a song for healing.
Yes.
Sick of it. Sick of it. I've done it too many times. How about this one? Here's one, okay? I was so moved by Caroline. I mean, like, this woman has like this vast amount of knowledge. And I mean, Shmuel, who you introduced me to, Leah, I've always known about his ability to wax poetic and poetically wax. What a great gathering you have of all of these people. Everybody has a story. And I'd like to sing this song because I think it can contextualize a lot of what was just shared. The world is a circle, a never-ending circle, never-ending circle going round and round. I see the sun go up, the moon go down, the world goes around and around and round. I am a part of the circle going round and round. We are a part of a part of the circle going round and round. Yes, you are. You've always been a part of the circle going round and round. You are a part of the circle going round and round.
Me.
Sinai Temple was created as Temple Sinai in 1909 in the wealthy part of town called Pico Union. And Russian Jews and Rabbi Israel came there, and he had dreams, and he was like this uber Zionist. He was an uber progressive, and he was an incredible lover of America. And he would preach about American values and that they were Jewish values, and he had found his homeland. What was it, like 40 years before Israel homeland was created. And Israel was a dream and America was a reality. He created Sinai Temple with an organ and with beautiful stained glass windows and wood, and it was the place to live, right next to all of the Mexican land barons, Alvarado and Figueroa. In 1926, his congregation had grown so quickly that it changed its name to Sinai Temple and did what all great Jewish congregations do. They move west. They go towards the beach. They go towards Holy Land, which at that time was Koreatown, or what we call Koreatown today. They sold their property to the Welsh Presbyterian community, and they created a shul on what they looked at as holy ground. It had an organ, for God's sakes, and it had these stars of David, and it must be blessed by the chosen people. And they kept that property for 88 years, doing an earthquake retrofit in 1984 when the only people in the neighborhood were gangbangers from El Salvador and MS-13 and 18th Street Gang. But they loved their home because it was given to them by their mentors, the Jewish immigrants from Russia. In 2013, my wife and I bought this building, and I was sick and tired of working in the Jewish community. I wanted to work with the community, and the best way I could do that was with music. And I was going to create a club. They had the best Scotch bar and the best food and the best music. Monday would be jazz, Tuesday would be Latino music, and Wednesday would be open mic night. And I asked my daughter, I said, Abby, you're like this community organizer. What would you do if you had this space? And she said, Daddy, that's the stupidest question I've ever heard. Why don't you ask the people what they would do with this space? And for 6 months, we asked the community what they would do with their space, and it had nothing to do with Scotch bars and very little to do with great food. They wanted housing. They wanted food justice. They wanted tree canopy. They wanted a safe place for their children to gather. They wanted what every immigrant wants to whatever they're going to. They want what Sam's family wanted, what his parents wanted. They wanted what Margarita's family wanted and Judith's family wanted. They wanted what Leah's family wanted. They wanted to know not what was, not what is, but what ought to be. And we created the Pico Union Project for us and for all of the immigrant dreamers in Los Angeles. Many people thought we were nuts. What's Jewish about reaching out to brown people? Why do you have to be a multi-faith space? We are. We have a Muslim group that meets there, Latino church, a Korean church, a African-American church, and a synagogue. What's Jewish about that? That's a desecration of the Jewish God's holy name. The playing field was leveled in February when everybody and their sister could get the COVID virus. Every immigrant could get it, every scholar could get it, every wealthy person could get it, brown, black, queer, straight, you all could get it. And then a couple of months later, 3 weeks ago, we saw this plague that suddenly appeared on the horizon that was now in our face. It was called racial bias and injustice. But it's been around for 400 years. It's not new. And I want to go back to what Rabbi Shmuel said. I said it was my words. We should not think what is or what was. All of us on this page should think what ought to be. And my sense right now is that we are at a turning point in America. When 2 years ago, nobody knew what Black Lives Matters was. To 2 weeks ago, when a huge chunk of the community was convinced that Black Lives Matter, especially in the Jewish community, was an anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist organization. Because that's what Black people do. They organize and try to take down the Jewish state. I'm being facetious. To yesterday, this group of people meeting at the city hall and saying, this is the people's budget. This is what we should be concerned about. And not being demonized. And having hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people all over the world saying, you know what? Maybe we should speak their language. If not speak their language, at least listen to them. We are a part of a circle that goes round and round, a circle that touches us sometimes and ignores us at other times. But we are a part of a magical orbit, and we can choose to be thrown into the stratosphere out of gravitational force, or we can be a part of something more powerful than us and create a better world, a world where, well, 3 years ago, nobody had LGBTQ rights. And yet yesterday, granted it was 2 people on the Supreme Court that made it happen, but that was legislated. Food security, food injustice, tree canopy, we can go on and on and on. That immigrant dreams that we all have spoken about for the last hour and a half are not only talked about, but empowered so that all of us are a part of a circle that is inclusive, part of a circle that enhances all of our lives, not just for some, but for all.
Yeah. Thank you, Craig, for always being a voice that speaks out, and to all of the panelists today for highlighting how we are such a beautifully diverse community in Los Angeles, and it's one of our greatest strengths. And let's all keep showing up and be the change we want to see in the world. I guess that concludes our tour of the United States. That concludes our tour of Los Angeles. I do have one more request, Craig, and I know you play this a million times, but could you play Holy Ground?
You said Hashkivenu.
Well, I was thinking maybe Holy Ground.
I'll do whatever you want.
Okay.
If anybody's interested, between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock tomorrow on Facebook, you can go to picounionproject.org and find out what the specifics are. But we're meeting with the people from Food Forward, Seeds of Hope, and Hilda Solis's office. We currently distribute 2,000 food for 2,000 families every week in Los Angeles. And to find out why it is that children in Los Angeles still go to bed hungry and what we can do to change that. Because I'm pretty sure there's no immigrant that ever dreamed of coming here and having their child go to bed hungry. It's picounionproject.org. Leah, you're the best, and I'm sending you my blessings and blessings for your mom's health and to all of us. Thank you for inviting me. What is it? What song am I singing?
Well,
Holy
either
Ground.
Hashkivenu or Holy Ground, you choose.
Let's have a vote. How many people want Hashkivenu? How many people want Holy Ground?
I think I saw more hands for Hashkivenu.
Hashkivenu. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu Leshalom V'hamidenu Malkei. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu Leshalom V'hamidenu Malkei. Nu Lechayim. Holy One, grant us the greatest gift that any human being can receive. Any parent, any child, any young person, any old person. The gift to wake up tomorrow with peace, in health, in a world filled with love. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu Leshalom V'hamidenu Malkei Nu Lechayim Ushmor Tzeteinu Uvoeinu.
Feel free to sing along.
V'chayim u'shmor me'ata ve'ad olam. Me'ata ve'ad olam. Me'ata ve'ad olam. World is a circle, a never-ending circle. Never-ending circle going round and round. I see the sun go up and the moon go down, and the moon goes around and around and round.
Hey, thank you so much, Craig. Your voice always, I don't know, fills my heart, and I know for many people we've been hearing your song for so many years, and just thank you for regrounding us in our hearts. Thank you to all the panelists, Dr. Luce, Shmuel, Sam, Craig. Thank you for taking us home. And thank you everybody who's joined me on this trip around the United States. It has been a real honor and a pleasure to see you keep showing up and sing the United States together. So with that said, I will post the videos later. It's going to take some time to upload. I think it's like 20 videos, but keep an eye out for that, and have a wonderful rest of your night, rest of your week. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Vered. Bye, Shmuel.
Hey, bye. Thank you for having me.
Bye.
I appreciate it. I
Always
really
a pleasure.
Come join us here. We have wonderful exhibit where people can learn more about this history, and Caroline put this together.
A group of us from Beth Am actually came a few years ago when Leah arranged a tour of Boyle Heights.
Yeah,
It was like
yeah.
together. It was wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. Now we finally have our installation of everyday viewable. So that's what's really cool. We're open 7 days a week. So we have a big community center open every day. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled. I drank the Kool-Aid with Craig. That's what happened. But I'm going to run and get some lunch, and hopefully we all do lunch at Cantor sometime soon.
Would love to.
Okay,
All right,
be well.
everybody. Have a great rest of your night. Take care.